Zimbabwe's economy has been heavily reliant on mining. This makes the sector a focal point during elections and otherwise. Conversations around the industry were highly politicized, as we saw during campaigning before the last general election. Zambia's default on its sovereign debt in November has put the country in a precarious economic situation. With copper prices at a 10-year high, Africa's second largest copper producer needs all the revenue it can earn. According to the Mines Ministry, Zambia produced a record 882,061 tons of copper in 2020, up 10.8% from the previous year. Mining contributes about 77% of total export value and 27.77% of government revenues, according to the latest EITI reporting. Zambia owes mining companies more than $1.5 billion in value-added tax, which is expected to be refunded. This is an issue that has soured relations between the government and the mining sector. The four largest mining companies in the country account for over 80% of copper production. Today, we're looking at restructuring Zambia's mining industry. I'm Tolulokwe Adeleru Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Joining me is financial analyst Trevor Hambayi. He's also the senior partner, Development Finance Associates. Trevor, once again, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me. All right. So, Trevor, just check your audio for us.
How are you?
Fantastic. Great. So we can hear you. So let me start with this. Now, many people really just want to look ahead to what could happen with Zimbabwe's mining industry. They want to push the old things under the carpet and sort of just progress beyond that. But it's necessary for us to understand the problems and the challenges that the new president, Hakainde Hichilema, will be facing. So what are some of the biggest issues the country's mining sector has to face currently?
So like you mentioned, the first one is obviously trying to be able to get as much revenue from the mining sector for the country to benefit. And for this to happen, we need to be able to cover the historic issues that we've had with the mining sector. And the first one is obviously the dispute that the mines have with the government around VAT refunds. For the last couple of years, the government has been refusing to pay back the VAT refunds because they're saying that the mines have not been paying their minority tax equivalent to what they're actually producing. And this is a dispute that has been ongoing since 2015, for which the government needs to resolve if we're going to get the benefits. Like you've seen at the moment, the price of copper is at its highest, and this should have been bringing value for the country, which it hasn't, because most of the mines are foreign owned and they're not contributing as much as they should be contributing towards government revenue.
All right, so Zambia has made changes to its mining taxation policies over the past several years, giving rise to debate and discussion and a lot of controversy. In December of 2018, the government changed its minerals tax regime for the 10th time in 16 years in an attempt to maximize both revenues and foreign investment. And it said that Zambia changes some kind of mining sector policy once every 18 months. Did any of these changes, particularly in the past decade, make any difference for the industry?
So firstly, from the government side, I don't think it has brought any value towards having to increase domestic revenue for government. What you do find is that the mining sector is generating around between $5 and $6 billion a year from copper exports, and they're only paying $300 million in domestic revenue or taxes. And this has been the basic issue, that government needs to increase this. And every time they're trying to do this, there's a very big dispute between the two. And this is the challenge. So the mining changes, the changes in the policy issues were designed to try and increase that revenue, but it still has not happened yet.
All right, so we've seen that President Hichilema's predecessor, Edgar Lungu, had pushed for a greater state ownership of the mines, but he said it wasn't full-on nationalization. the state mining investment company ZCCM-IH took on a $1.5 billion debt in January in order to take over Glencore's majority stake in the Mopani copper mine. And this is a particularly contentious issue. And we've heard statements from the president, but let's clarify what is President Hichilema's stance on this issue of state ownership versus nationalization versus some form of equity share in it?
I think the current president, Hakainde Hichilema, is very categorical about this position, and that they believe that we must run a private-driven economy. And so these mines should be held by private entities and not government. The key aspect also is that government does not have the kind of resources to be able to invest into these mines. And they'll be looking at having the mines being owned by private entities and government providing the policies that support that kind of development. The Achilles heel there is obviously that with them being owned by the private entities, will they be able to pay the kind of tax that is consistent to creating value for the country? Because of the fact that this is one of the biggest export earning entity in the country, in the industry, it is important that government gets the right value from this.
So in justifying, I just want to stick with this for a bit. In justifying more state ownership of the mines, the former president said that owning a stake in some strategic mines gives the state the leverage required to utilize the defined mineral resources to benefit the nation. And mineral resource utilization or nationalization by countries is not so new. But it hasn't, as you said, it hasn't really borne out because many governments lack the capacity to fully utilize these natural resources. But people would wonder, have Zambians, I beg your pardon, ever really benefited from the mining activities in the country? Is there a compromise to be found in this state ownership conversation and private sector, private investment-driven initiative or direction that we'll see President Hichilema take?
So in essence, the Zambians have generally not benefited. I mean, until 1991, when we started to actually implement a privatization policy, everything was government owned. And at that time, I think the Zambians were benefiting from this because all the resources were being retained in the country. But once we privatized, I think the strategy, which must be speaking to most of the African countries, is that the mines should be owned by nationals. And the country must be able to determine how they can put together the resources that actually provides access to credit for the nationals to be able to invest. That is the single challenge that we have on the African continent, that we believe that we do not have the capital resources to be able to invest into these mines. But once we structure this in the right way, the African continent can still borrow on a commercial rate to be able to invest into the mines which are owned by nationals, which will be able to create a long-term growth for the African continent, that these resources are being mined by nationals and the resources are being benefited by the nationals. And I think that is key to having to deal with the challenge. So long-term strategy, it is not an immediate one, but I think it's we should all be considering.
Okay, so before we go for a break, let's talk about the VAT. $1.5 billion in VAT refunds. That's what Zambia owes mining companies. And Zambia's Chamber of Mines CEO, Godwin Benny, who represents mining companies like First Quantum Minerals, Barrick Gold, and others, has said that VAT refunds are a top priority for the industry. But this is also a lot of money for Zambia's government to have to pay up at this point in time. What do you think is the best approach for President Hichilema's administration to take on this issue?
I think more importantly, they would have to consider having to stagger this repayment. I don't think they can afford to pay it immediately, but also it is important to understand the basis on which this 1.5 billion accumulated. Firstly, is that the mines have been given a lot of rebates in terms of imports, and this is where the VAT refund comes in. They also got tax holidays in terms of what they are paying in income tax. This also needs to be realigned to be able to ensure that the country is benefiting, because when you knock off the VAT refunds and the tax that they're paying, the country is generally not benefiting. We are subsidizing the operations of the mines, And this needs to change. And I think this is where the dispute is. And until we can get past this issue, it is inconsistently not sustainable for the country to continue paying the VAT refunds, because technically we are subsidizing their operations.
But very quickly, you had mentioned earlier that there is criticism that the mines are actually not remitting the amounts that they should be remitting over the past several years. So where does that come in this conversation about the VAT refund?
So there are two sides. One of the things is that firstly, the mines have got concessions. They've got a 10-year concession in which they've got a tax holiday where they're not paying as a tax as high as they should. I mean, at the moment, they're remitting around 6% in terms of tax, whereas the average tax in the country for income tax, corporate income tax, is around 30%. So this is where the challenge is. And when they do get the rebates, which they get on importation of equipment and raw material, they get the customs and duty rebate. This is where the VAT refund is supposed to come from. It knocks out any amount that they're actually paying. And I think we need to be able to have a balance that works for both parties.
All right, Trevor, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll get into a bit more about the local ownership, because there is a segment of the mining industry that could very well be a stumbling block when it comes to the president's attempt to restructure Zambia's mining sector. You're watching Business Edge. We will be back right after this. You're watching Business Edge, and today we're talking about restructuring Zambia's mining industry. Financial analyst Trevor Habayi is with me. Now, another issue that the president will face is around the issue of local ownership. President Hichilema has promised to facilitate local ownership, implying that artisanal miners will have to be licensed and formalized. Hundreds of artisanal miners, locally known as jarabos, have occupied at least 2 open mine pits since June, claiming they were granted access by a government official as part of a youth empowerment program. Jarabo's occupation of various open mines has in the past disrupted various government deals with mining companies. The president wants to boost investor confidence and also empower the people. Now, Trevor, how should he deal with the Jarabo's issue? Because they are it's an interesting conversation around there. There has been some political use for this segment of miners as well, but in trying to formalize them and regularize them, many people are anticipating that the president will run into issues. What do you think about this?
Firstly, it is very important that the president works towards having to be able to formalize them. You will appreciate that 60% of the Zambian population is consisted of youth below the age of 35. And it is one of the key aspects in his campaign strategy that is speaking to creating employment as well as developing youth entrepreneurship. So irrespective of how we approach this, it will be very, very cardinal that he finds a way to be able to do this. And the artisanal mining, which is a small and medium enterprise, is a key component in having to develop a long-term mine ownership for the country that is driven by local nationals. And this is where they're going to need to start from. It might be a question where they need to move them away from the large areas that they're actually occupying for them to be able to start having to do this from new ground where they can actually own the mines without having to create a dispute with the large ones.
All right, so we've seen copper prices at a 10-year high. Zambia produced a record 882,000 plus tons of copper in 2020. Even though we know that there's so much more potential for the country, how do you think Zambia can currently leverage on the royalties, the taxes, the levies that are currently coming in right now?
We need to get our mining policy right. I mean, this is a key aspect in terms of having to leverage this. The first thing is that the right mining policy will be able to guarantee the fact that the current mining entities that are in the country will increase their productivity. But also this will attract additional financing and investors to come into the country to be able to do this. But that policy must also be inclusive of the local domestic investors who are the Zambians, so that they are part of this, whether it is a policy that allows a minimum equity position for Zambians to be part of the owners, or it is one that actually provides direct financing to support the locals to go into new mining. We need to have a standard where both parties are going to benefit from this. Otherwise, we are getting all our resources depleting, and yet the country is not receiving any sustainable development from this.
Okay, you sort of gone into my second question, which was to look at the expected mining policies that will come up under the president. But let's also talk about the new mines minister, Paul Kabuswe. And he has said that the administration will ensure stability and predictability in the mining sector, and that government must root out corruption in mining, which is the engine of Zambia's economy. This corruption issue has been a long-standing, as we talked about, historic debts as well, historic corruption in the industry. If the administration is going to succeed with stability, predictability, and rooting out corruption, how must they do that?
The issue of corruption is not just about the mining sector. I think it is an issue that has been of concern for the entire country. It has spoken to a lot of issues in terms of where the country is. It is spoken to the poor infrastructure that we have contracted loans for because they were issued under corrupt tendencies, as well as abuse of power and overpricing of infrastructure. It is also an issue that has driven the country into a debt situation because people were getting kickbacks in having to acquire all this debt. So the issue of corruption is that it is paramount. It is not just for the mining sector, and we must show the commitment to want to stamp this out by ensuring that all the ones that have committed these crimes are brought to book, and ensuring that anybody in the new government who tries to be able to do corrupt practices is brought to book as well. So it covers the entire country rather than just the mining sector.
So we know last November, the country became the first African nation to default on its sovereign debt during the COVID-19 pandemic after failing to keep up with payments on nearly $13 billion of international debt. We also see that the mining industry can help Zambia address this economic issue. We've heard the president say that he inherited a basically empty coffer from the previous administration. Are there any prospects for new exploration, new investments, or anything that will come into the mining industry specifically? What do you think multilateral or multinational investors are looking for from this administration in order to come back to Zambia or to now invest in Zambia?
That's a pretty straightforward issue. The country has a lot of potential in the mining sector, and the key driving factor for any potential international investors to come back and continue to invest into the mining sector is policy stability, that we need policy that is favorable and that is stable, that they know that once they have made this investment, that policy is going to hold for the next 10 years and it secures their investment. And I think government is looking at the strategies, what they need to be able to do to be able to create this balance, which allows external investors to be able to come in, but also promotes domestic local investors to go into the sector.
And as we expand this a bit away from just the mining sector, there's a lot of conversation about opening up Zambia's economy. You have a president that is an accountant who is a businessman as well, known as Bali, internally the father. But we also have external debt that includes $3 billion in Euro bonds, $3.5 billion in bilateral debt, $2.1 billion owed to multilateral agencies, and $2.9 billion in commercial bank debt. Many people are anticipating some kind of conversation, which has been ongoing with the IMF, and there are going to be tough decisions that the president has to make that may not necessarily be decisions that many Zambians will be happy about. What do you think these tough decisions are going to be? Those that address the issues in the mining industry and also the larger economic situation of the country?
So in driving this, in ensuring that the mining sector can get off the ground and start to contribute to the national development, is that we need to be able to create a stable macroeconomic conditions, which includes the issue around our debt situation. And in our debt situation, we will need to restructure our debt. Having to restructure this debt might mean having to refinance it so that it's a longer repayment period. And having to refinance this is that we will have to be able to have the IMF to come on board to support us. And this is key. But the IMF will also be putting conditions to the country. Although in the recent times, what you do actually understand is that the IMF is working towards homegrown solutions. So they will not be coming with a hard and fast rule as to what we need to do. They'll be wanting to listen to what our policy is and how we want to achieve our economic sustainability. And they want to work with us in that strategy. But yes, as a country, the president would have to make hard decisions, which include having to lift any subsidies that we might have. It will include having to have a freeze on employment in the civil service. It will include having to maybe liquidate some state-owned companies so that they're private-owned to reduce government liability. But those are hard decisions that we need to take for us to be able to get the economy back on track.
So my last question is a yes or no question, Trevor. How optimistic are you that President Hakainde Hichilema can achieve the things he has set out to in the next 5 years?
I'm very positive, 95%.
95. We'll leave it at that. I said yes or no, then you ended up with 95%. But Trevor, thank you for joining me. We look forward to having these conversations. A lot of focus will remain on Zambia and President Hichilema in the next few months as we see what the economic conditions in terms of restructuring Zambia will be. Thank you, as always, for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. So we are, of course, watching things as they develop in Zambia. A lot of challenges and problems and also potential on hand for the country, particularly with its mining industry and copper prices being at a 10-year high. Can Zambia harness all of this and truly live up to its potential? It remains to be seen, but we will be watching. Something else we're watching, a few stories that we're keeping our eyes on. NC42 Watch is up next. And we start in the southern part of the continent, where South African Airways interim CEO has said that the airline will need a more modern fleet to be competitive on routes outside its home continent following the COVID-19 crisis. SAA is set to restart operations next week after emerging from bankruptcy proceedings about 18 months after the fleet was grounded at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Flights are set to operate from Johannesburg to Cape Town, plus Accra, Kinshasa, Harare, Lusaka, and Maputo. And staying in the country, South Africa's mining sector has shrugged off the effects of the shutdowns introduced in March 2020, with production now back to pre-COVID levels. Mining production is up 10.3% year-on-year for July 2021, with more than half of this improvement coming from iron ore and platinum group metals. Now to the west, where Ghana has picked Rockshore International as a strategic partner to build a mine and refinery in a bid to develop an industry out of its untapped bauxite reserves. Now, the Accra-based company will own a 70% stake in the project, and the state-owned Ghana Integrated Aluminum Development will have the remaining 30%. Rockshore will lead the construction of a $200 million mine in central Ghana and a refinery worth about $1 billion. And finally, the International Monetary Fund has approved $67 million emergency fund for Equatorial Guinea. The money is meant to help the country deal with the impact of the coronavirus pandemic and an explosion at a military base that destroyed much of its mainland city of Bata in March. The IMF said the financial support requested by the oil-dependent Central African state would help mitigate the fallout from both shocks. And that's it on Business Edge. Don't forget to head to our YouTube channel as well as subscribe if you've missed any of our conversations on the big business, economic, and financial stories coming out of the continent. You can follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV, and of course, watch us as we are live on StarTimes Channel 274, Avo TV Channel 23, and Free TV 247. Until Monday morning, 11 a.m. West African time, I'll be back then with more. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulokwe Adileru Balogun.